What transforms a village boy into a hunter of the skies? And why has his name almost vanished from the great chronicles of war, even though he received 2 gold stars of hero and 1 where others failed? Behind every sortie stood decisions that were never printed in newspapers. Moments when smoke filled the cockpit and instruments went blind. Minutes when orders came through the radio that were better left unspoken. Arseny Vorozheikin went where the line was thinnest and returned not always as a triumphant hero, but sometimes as a silent witness to the mistakes of others. His score impresses, yet the stories that never reached the reports are even more striking. The jealousy of comrades, disputed awards, strange appointments, the silence that followed the war. In the end, we will uncover why dazzling victories do not always guarantee lasting fame and what price he paid to command the sky. Watch until the end, because the most uncomfortable questions await there. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. The village of Barsuki in Kursk province offered little promise to a boy born in the final days of Imperial Russia. Vasily Vorozheikin worked the land with calloused hands. His wife Maria kept their modest home, and young Arseny absorbed the rhythms of rural life. The revolution swept across the empire when he was 5, transforming the world around him while he remained immersed in childhood games and village routines. Perhaps it was the vastness of the Russian sky that first called to him. The steppe stretched endlessly, broken only by flights of birds moving with effortless grace through an element denied to humans. Unlike many future aviators inspired by tales of pioneers, Vorozheikin's fascination with flight arose naturally from his surroundings. The sky represented freedom from the narrow path of agricultural labor. His early education reflected the turbulence of the new Soviet system. Schools opened and closed, teachers came and went, curricula shifted with politics. Yet through it all, he displayed unusual mechanical aptitude and determination. While other boys played with toys, he built models from scrap. Physics lessons became practical problems of flight and motion in his imagination. The path from rural boyhood to the army was gradual. First came labor conscription, where his technical skills drew notice. Then regular military service, which he viewed not with dread, but with anticipation. The army promised opportunities unavailable in village life, especially for young men with mechanical interests and leadership potential. His assignment to aviation units was partly chance, partly necessity. In the early 1930s, the Soviet Air Force urgently needed recruits able to combine technical knowledge with courage. Vorozheikin possessed both. Even more, he showed the quick decision-making and resilience under stress that combat flying demanded. The training that turned peasants into pilots was brutal. Many failed ground school, unable to master complex theory. Others froze during flight training, overwhelmed by fear. Vorozheikin not only survived but excelled, marked for advanced roles. Instructors noted 3 qualities that later defined his combat style. First, uncanny spatial orientation during aerobatics that disoriented others. Second, exceptional gunnery accuracy, hinting at natural skill in the calculations of air combat. Third, clear leadership potential in his dealings with fellow students. By the time he completed training, he had enough flying hours for operational duty, and more importantly, the confidence for independent command decisions. These qualities would prove crucial as international tensions mounted and war loomed ever closer. The conflict at Khalkhin Gol in 1939 provided Vorozheikin his introduction to aerial combat, flying approximately 100 sorties in the Polikarpov I-16 fighter. This remote corner of Mongolia, where Soviet and Japanese forces clashed over disputed territory, became his classroom for the harsh lessons of air warfare. The desert landscape below offered little refuge for pilots whose aircraft suffered damage or mechanical failure. Victory meant survival. Defeat often meant death in the vast emptiness of the Mongolian plateau. The I-16 that Vorozheikin mastered was an unforgiving machine that demanded respect from even experienced pilots. Its stubby design and powerful engine created handling characteristics that could surprise the unwary. The aircraft was fast and maneuverable, but also temperamental and difficult to control during certain flight regimes. Many pilots never fully adapted to its quirks. Vorozheikin not only learned to fly the I-16 effectively, but pushed it to performance limits that other aviators considered dangerous. His first aerial victory came after weeks of inconclusive engagements with Japanese fighters. The kill was a Nakajima Ki-27, shot down during a swirling dogfight that tested every aspect of his training and natural ability. Unlike the dramatic accounts that often accompany first combat victories, Vorozheikin's initial success was methodical and precise. He maneuvered his opponent into a disadvantageous position, delivered accurate bursts of gunfire, and watched the enemy aircraft spiral toward the desert floor below. The psychological impact of that first kill was profound. Combat flying requires pilots to overcome fundamental human instincts for self-preservation while simultaneously trying to destroy other human beings. Many aviators struggle with this contradiction, either becoming overly cautious or developing reckless attitudes that prove equally dangerous. Vorozheikin found his balance quickly. He approached aerial combat with the same analytical mindset that had served him during training, treating each engagement as a technical problem requiring methodical solution. His combat record in Mongolia included 12 shared victories in addition to his individual kill. The distinction between individual and shared victories was important for both tactical and administrative reasons. Individual kills required clear documentation that a specific pilot had caused an enemy aircraft to crash. Shared victories occurred when multiple pilots engaged the same target, making individual responsibility difficult to determine. Both types of victories contributed to overall unit effectiveness, but individual kills carried greater weight for promotion and decoration purposes. The shared victories reflected Vorozheikin's developing understanding of aerial tactics. Successful air combat required coordination between multiple aircraft, with pilots supporting each other through carefully choreographed maneuvers. Solo heroics might produce spectacular results in specific circumstances, but systematic teamwork generated consistent victory rates over extended periods. Vorozheikin learned to balance individual initiative with group coordination, a skill that would prove essential during the larger conflicts ahead. His performance at Khalkhin Gol earned recognition from superiors who were already identifying promising officers for expanded responsibilities. When the fighting ended, he held the position of squadron commissar in the 56th Fighter Aviation Regiment. This dual role as pilot and political officer reflected the Soviet system's emphasis on ideological reliability alongside professional competence. The appointment indicated that Vorozheikin had demonstrated both flying ability and leadership potential suitable for future advancement. The Mongolian experience also provided lessons about equipment, tactics, and logistics that would influence his approach to subsequent conflicts. The harsh environment tested both human endurance and mechanical reliability in ways that peacetime training could never replicate. Aircraft that performed flawlessly during routine operations developed unexpected problems when subjected to combat stress and extreme weather conditions. Pilots discovered gaps in their training that became apparent only when facing life or death situations with incomplete information and minimal support. June 22, 1941, transformed the theoretical possibility of war into devastating reality. The German invasion caught the Soviet military in various states of unpreparedness, despite growing intelligence warnings about enemy intentions. For pilots like Vorozheikin, the opening phase of the conflict meant transitioning abruptly from peacetime routines to desperate defensive battles against an enemy that possessed significant tactical advantages. The initial Luftwaffe strikes demonstrated the vulnerability of Soviet aviation caught on the ground. Entire air regiments vanished in minutes as German bombers and fighters swept across forward airfields with precision timing. Surviving pilots found themselves fighting not just enemy aircraft, but also equipment shortages, communication breakdowns, and the psychological pressure of constant retreat. These conditions eliminated many aviators who might have excelled during more favorable circumstances. Vorozheikin's previous combat experience at Khalkhin Gol provided crucial advantages during this chaotic period. While many of his colleagues struggled to adapt to the realities of aerial warfare, he already understood the fundamental principles of air combat survival. His methodical approach to tactical problems served him well when faced with the superior training and equipment of German opponents, who had gained experience during earlier campaigns in Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. The aircraft available to Soviet pilots during the early phase of the war were often inferior to their German counterparts in significant ways. The I-16 fighters that had seemed adequate against Japanese opponents in Mongolia proved vulnerable to the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and other advanced German designs. Soviet pilots had to compensate for equipment disadvantages through superior tactics, better knowledge of local conditions, and willingness to accept higher risks than their opponents. Vorozheikin adapted his fighting style to exploit the few advantages available to Soviet aviation. The I-16's tight turning radius allowed experienced pilots to outmaneuver German fighters in specific circumstances. Its robust construction enabled the aircraft to absorb battle damage that might have destroyed more lightly built designs. Most importantly, Soviet pilots fighting over their own territory could afford to take risks that would have been suicidal for German aviators operating far from their bases. His first significant victories during the Great Patriotic War came during defensive battles that tested every aspect of his flying ability. German formations approached with systematic precision that reflected thorough planning and extensive training. Soviet responses were often improvised and desperate, relying more on individual courage than coordinated strategy. In such circumstances, pilots like Vorozheikin, who could think quickly and act decisively, possessed enormous value for their units. The transition from defensive to offensive operations occurred gradually as Soviet forces gained experience and received improved equipment. New aircraft types like the Yak-1 and LAGG-3 offered better performance characteristics than the obsolete I-16, though they still required careful handling to compete effectively against German fighters. Vorozheikin mastered each new aircraft type rapidly, demonstrating the versatility that distinguished exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. His reputation within the aviation community grew steadily as his victory total accumulated. Fellow pilots began to study his techniques and emulate his tactical approaches. Ground crews competed for assignment to his aircraft, recognizing that successful pilots received priority for maintenance and equipment. Squadron commanders sought his advice on operational planning, valuing his insights into enemy capabilities and vulnerabilities. The psychological demands of sustained combat operations tested pilots in ways that peacetime training could never anticipate. The constant threat of death or capture, combined with physical exhaustion and equipment shortages, created stress levels that broke many otherwise competent aviators. Vorozheikin not only endured these pressures, but seemed to thrive under conditions that incapacitated others. His methodical temperament provided stability that benefited entire units during critical operations. The first Hero of the Soviet Union award came as recognition for sustained combat excellence that had established Vorozheikin among the elite fighter pilots of the Red Air Force. The Gold Star Medal represented more than individual achievement. It symbolized the transformation of a peasant's son into a master of modern warfare. Yet the decoration also brought expectations and responsibilities that would complicate his remaining war service in unexpected ways. The formal ceremony took place against a backdrop of continuing military operations that allowed little time for celebration. Heroes were expected to return quickly to combat duties, using their enhanced prestige to inspire subordinates and maintain unit morale during difficult periods. Vorozheikin accepted these obligations without complaint, recognizing that personal recognition served larger purposes within the Soviet military system. His tactical innovations began attracting attention from training specialists who were developing new combat doctrines based on battlefield experience. The methodical approach that characterized his flying style proved adaptable to various combat situations, providing examples for instruction programs designed to improve overall pilot effectiveness. Young aviators studied recordings of his mission debriefings, learning to apply systematic analysis to the chaotic environment of aerial warfare. The second Hero of the Soviet Union decoration elevated Vorozheikin into truly exclusive company. Only a handful of Soviet citizens received this honor twice during the Great Patriotic War, and most of those were senior commanders whose contributions extended beyond individual combat performance. For a pilot still engaged in regular flying duties to achieve such recognition indicated exceptional sustained performance over extended periods. Between the two decorations, his responsibilities had expanded beyond individual combat effectiveness. Squadron leadership required balancing the competing demands of tactical innovation, pilot training, and administrative oversight. Successful combat pilots did not automatically become effective commanders, as the skills required for air-to-air combat differed significantly from those needed for unit management. Vorozheikin demonstrated competence in both areas, though not without occasional conflicts with higher authority. His growing reputation created opportunities for influence within broader aviation policy discussions. Senior officers sought his recommendations on aircraft procurement, training curricula, and tactical doctrine development. These consultations reflected the Soviet system's emphasis on practical experience over theoretical knowledge, particularly in areas where rapid technological change demanded constant adaptation of established procedures. The increasing administrative responsibilities began to conflict with his preference for direct combat participation. Staff assignments offered career advancement and reduced personal risk, but they also meant less time in the cockpit engaging enemy fighters. For pilots whose identity was intimately connected with flying ability, such transitions could prove psychologically difficult. Vorozheikin managed to balance competing demands without sacrificing effectiveness in either area. His influence on younger pilots became one of his most significant contributions during the later phases of the war. The systematic approach that had enabled his personal success translated effectively into training methodologies that improved overall unit performance. Students learned not just specific tactical techniques, but also the analytical thinking processes that enabled adaptation to changing circumstances. This intellectual approach to combat flying distinguished Soviet aviation training from earlier emphasis on instinct and aggression alone. The decorations and recognition also attracted unwanted attention from political authorities who were increasingly concerned with post-war planning and power consolidation. Successful military officers represented both valuable assets and potential threats within the Soviet system. Heroes who had demonstrated independent thinking and leadership capability required careful management to ensure continued loyalty and effectiveness. Vorozheikin navigated these political waters with the same methodical approach he applied to aerial combat, though with less decisive results. Success in combat aviation created its own unique pressures that extended far beyond the immediate dangers of enemy fire. As Vorozheikin's reputation grew, so did the expectations placed upon him by superiors, subordinates, and the propaganda apparatus that transformed individual achievements into symbols of broader ideological victories. The psychological weight of constantly meeting these expectations began to affect even pilots with his exceptional mental resilience. The nature of aerial warfare meant that survival often depended on split-second decisions made with incomplete information under extreme stress. Even the most skilled pilots occasionally made choices that resulted in mission failures or friendly casualties. These incidents, while statistically inevitable, created guilt and self-doubt that could undermine future performance if not properly managed. Vorozheikin's methodical temperament helped him process such experiences constructively, but the cumulative effect remained significant. His relationships with other pilots reflected the complex dynamics that developed within elite units. Exceptional performers could inspire their colleagues to greater efforts, but they could also create resentment among those who felt overshadowed by superior achievements. Squadron harmony required delicate balancing of individual recognition with collective identity. Vorozheikin generally maintained positive relationships with fellow aviators, though not without occasional tensions that reflected these underlying dynamics. The equipment available to Soviet pilots improved significantly as the war progressed, but mechanical reliability remained a constant concern. Aircraft that had been rushed into production to meet urgent wartime needs often developed unexpected problems during extended operations. Pilots learned to compensate for known deficiencies while remaining alert for new failure modes that could prove fatal during combat. Vorozheikin's technical knowledge served him well in these circumstances, though even his expertise could not eliminate all risks associated with imperfect machinery. Administrative conflicts became increasingly common as his reputation attracted attention from staff officers who viewed successful combat pilots as resources to be managed rather than warriors to be supported. Requests for his participation in training programs, propaganda activities, and planning conferences multiplied faster than available time. Balancing these competing demands while maintaining combat readiness required diplomatic skills that had not been part of his original aviation training. The physical demands of sustained combat operations gradually accumulated into chronic health issues that affected many veteran pilots. Long hours in cramped cockpits, repeated exposure to high G-forces, and constant stress created musculoskeletal problems that reduced comfort and potentially impaired performance. Sleep deprivation and irregular nutrition compounded these difficulties. Vorozheikin managed these challenges better than most, but even his robust constitution showed signs of accumulated wear. Enemy tactics evolved continuously throughout the war as German pilots adapted to Soviet improvements in equipment and technique. Initial German advantages in training and experience gradually diminished as the war progressed, but Luftwaffe aviators remained dangerous opponents who could exploit any tactical errors or equipment failures. Staying ahead of this evolutionary process required constant learning and adaptation that placed additional intellectual demands on already overtaxed pilots. Intelligence reports about captured Soviet aviators provided disturbing insights into German treatment of prisoners. Pilots who survived being shot down often faced interrogation, imprisonment, or execution rather than the protection supposedly guaranteed by international conventions. This knowledge added psychological pressure to every mission, as the consequences of mechanical failure or tactical error extended beyond personal death to potential capture and mistreatment. The character of aerial warfare changed dramatically during the final phases of the Great Patriotic War, as Soviet forces transitioned from defensive operations to sustained offensive campaigns that carried the fight deep into German territory. For veteran pilots like Vorozheikin, these changes brought new challenges that tested skills developed during earlier phases of the conflict in unfamiliar contexts. Ground support operations required different tactics than the air superiority missions that had characterized much of his earlier combat experience. Working with advancing tank columns and infantry units demanded precise coordination and communication protocols that had not been necessary during purely defensive engagements. The risk of friendly fire incidents increased significantly when Soviet aircraft operated in close proximity to their own ground forces. The improved aircraft available during this period offered enhanced performance capabilities that veteran pilots had to master while continuing regular combat operations. The transition from familiar aircraft types to new designs created temporary vulnerabilities as pilots adapted to different handling characteristics and operating procedures. Vorozheikin's technical background enabled him to make these transitions more smoothly than many colleagues, but even his adaptability was tested by rapid technological changes. German resistance intensified as Soviet forces approached the borders of the Reich itself. Enemy pilots fighting over their homeland displayed desperation and determination that exceeded what Soviet aviators had encountered during earlier campaigns. The introduction of new German aircraft types and weapon systems created tactical challenges that required rapid adaptation of established combat techniques. Victory was no longer assured by superior numbers alone. His role as squadron leader became more complex as unit responsibilities expanded to include training replacement pilots while maintaining operational effectiveness. The constant flow of new personnel created training burdens that veteran pilots were expected to manage alongside their regular combat duties. Balancing these competing demands required organizational skills that extended beyond individual flying ability. Strategic bombing missions against German industrial targets exposed Soviet pilots to concentrated flak defenses and fighter interceptions that differed significantly from the more dispersed threats encountered during ground support operations. Long-range missions over enemy territory eliminated the safety net provided by friendly territory, increasing psychological pressure on pilots who could not afford mechanical failures or navigation errors. The advancing front lines created logistical challenges that affected aircraft maintenance and supply operations. Established airbases were abandoned as operations moved westward, requiring rapid construction of new facilities with limited resources and time. These constraints affected aircraft availability and maintenance quality, forcing pilots to accept higher risks from mechanical failures and equipment shortages. Intelligence about German secret weapons programs added new dimensions to tactical planning. Reports of jet aircraft, guided missiles, and other advanced systems required Soviet commanders to consider threats that had not existed earlier in the war. While many of these weapons appeared too late or in too small numbers to affect the war's outcome significantly, their existence influenced tactical decisions and strategic planning. Recognition ceremonies and propaganda activities continued throughout this period, as political authorities sought to maintain public support for military operations, despite increasing casualties and war weariness. Veteran pilots were expected to participate in these events while maintaining their combat responsibilities. The time and energy required for such activities reduced available resources for training and operational preparation. Victory seemed increasingly inevitable by early 1945. But the approach of peace created new uncertainties about post-war career prospects for military aviators. Officers who had spent their entire adult lives in military service faced questions about their roles in peacetime society. These concerns added psychological complexity to the final months of combat operations, as pilots contemplated personal futures alongside immediate tactical challenges. The transition from wartime hero to peacetime officer proved as challenging as any aerial combat Vorozheikin had faced during his distinguished combat career. Victory brought new responsibilities as he commanded aviation regiments and divisions, eventually serving as first deputy commander of Black Sea Fleet Air Defense. The skills that had made him exceptional in aerial warfare translated imperfectly to the administrative and political demands of peacetime military service. The Soviet military underwent massive reorganization following the defeat of Germany, as wartime expedients gave way to systematic planning for future conflicts. Nuclear weapons and jet aircraft promised to revolutionize warfare in ways that made previous experience only partially relevant. Veteran officers like Vorozheikin faced the challenge of adapting their hard-won knowledge to rapidly changing technological and strategic circumstances. His assignment as a senior training pilot for combat training tactical aircraft reflected the military's recognition of his expertise and the need to transfer combat experience to newer generations of aviators. The systematic approach that had characterized his own combat career proved valuable for developing training curricula that emphasized analytical thinking alongside traditional flying skills. The aircraft available to post-war Soviet aviation differed dramatically from the propeller-driven fighters that had dominated wartime operations. Jet engines offered unprecedented performance, but required different operational procedures and maintenance protocols. Adapting to these changes required the same methodical approach that had enabled his wartime success, though the learning curve was steep even for experienced pilots. Training responsibilities brought him into contact with young aviators who had no combat experience, but possessed theoretical knowledge that often exceeded his own in specialized areas. Balancing respect for academic expertise with hard-won practical wisdom required diplomatic skills that had not been necessary during wartime command relationships. The most effective training programs combined both perspectives in ways that prepared pilots for modern warfare's changing requirements. His pursuit of advanced education culminated in graduation from the military academy in 1952, demonstrating his commitment to intellectual development alongside practical experience. The systematic study of military theory and history provided broader context for understanding his wartime experiences and their relevance to future conflicts. Administrative duties increasingly dominated his time as he progressed through senior positions that carried significant responsibilities for personnel management, budget oversight, and strategic planning. These tasks required skills that differed substantially from those needed for combat flying, though his methodical approach remained relevant for analyzing complex organizational problems. The political environment of the early Cold War affected all aspects of military service, as officers were expected to demonstrate ideological reliability alongside professional competence. Vorozheikin navigated these requirements with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his combat career. Though the political dimensions added complexity that had not existed during wartime operations, focused on clearly defined military objectives. Recognition for his wartime achievements continued through various ceremonies and commemorative events that served propaganda purposes while honoring genuine contributions to victory. Participating in these activities required balancing personal modesty with institutional needs for symbols that could inspire current military personnel and maintain public support for defense spending. His influence on aviation doctrine development reflected the Soviet military's emphasis on learning from combat experience to improve future effectiveness. The tactical innovations he had pioneered during wartime operations provided examples for training programs and operational procedures that would benefit subsequent generations of military aviators. This intellectual contribution extended his impact beyond individual achievement to systemic improvement. Fame in the Soviet system followed patterns that reflected political priorities as much as individual achievement. While Vorozheikin's combat record equaled or exceeded that of more celebrated pilots, his public profile remained curiously muted compared to contemporaries who achieved similar military success. The reasons for this relative obscurity reveal much about how wartime heroism was packaged for peacetime consumption. Alexander Pokryshkin and Ivan Kozhedub became household names whose exploits were celebrated in books, films, and official histories that shaped popular understanding of Soviet aviation achievements. Their stories fit neatly into propaganda narratives that emphasized specific ideological themes and personal characteristics deemed suitable for public emulation. Vorozheikin's more complex personality and career path proved less adaptable to such simplified presentation. The systematic approach that had made him exceptional as a combat pilot may have worked against him in peacetime political calculations. Officers who demonstrated excessive independence of thought, even when accompanied by unquestioned loyalty, could be viewed as potential threats by a system that valued conformity alongside competence. His methodical analysis of problems sometimes led to conclusions that conflicted with preferred solutions. Geographic factors also influenced the allocation of recognition and publicity resources. Pilots who served in high-profile campaigns that attracted media attention were more likely to become public figures than those whose equally significant contributions occurred in less visible contexts. The specific units and fronts where Vorozheikin achieved his victories may not have aligned with propaganda priorities that emphasized certain battles over others. The post-war careers of celebrated pilots followed different trajectories that affected their long-term public visibility. Those who transitioned successfully to positions in aviation industry, government, or military leadership remained in public view through their continued activities. Vorozheikin's focus on training and administrative roles, while valuable for military effectiveness, offered fewer opportunities for continued media exposure. Personal characteristics that had served him well in combat may have limited his appeal for peacetime celebrity status. The methodical temperament and analytical approach that enabled his military success did not translate easily into the charismatic personality traits that propaganda specialists preferred for public heroes. His reluctance to engage in self-promotion contrasted with colleagues who actively cultivated their public images. The specific nature of his combat achievements may have been difficult to explain to general audiences who lacked technical knowledge about aerial warfare. While his victory totals were impressive, the tactical innovations and leadership contributions that distinguished his service required more sophisticated presentation than simple numerical comparisons. Complex achievements resist the simplified narratives that work best for mass communication. Institutional politics within the aviation community also played a role in determining which pilots received sustained attention from historians and biographers. Officers who maintained influence within post-war military organizations were better positioned to ensure that their contributions received appropriate recognition in official accounts. Those who focused primarily on their professional duties might find their achievements understated in historical records. The evolution of Soviet military doctrine during the early Cold War period emphasized different aspects of aviation warfare than those that had been most important during the Great Patriotic War. Pilots whose wartime experiences aligned with emerging strategic priorities were more likely to remain relevant for contemporary discussions. while those whose contributions reflected earlier phases of military development might be gradually overlooked. The relative absence of detailed public information about Vorozheikin's career inevitably generated speculation and rumor among aviation enthusiasts and military historians who recognized the discrepancy between his documented achievements and his limited public recognition. These discussions, conducted largely within specialized communities, created an alternative narrative that may or may not reflect historical reality. Some observers suggested that his methodical approach to problems occasionally brought him into conflict with superiors who preferred more conventional solutions to tactical and administrative challenges. The Soviet military system, despite its emphasis on innovation and adaptation, could be suspicious of officers whose independent thinking led them to question established procedures or propose alternatives that differed from accepted doctrine. Others speculated about possible disagreements regarding post-war aviation policy or strategic planning that might have reduced his influence within the military hierarchy. Officers who had achieved significant wartime recognition sometimes found themselves marginalized during peacetime, if their views conflicted with evolving institutional priorities or political considerations that extended beyond purely military factors. The possibility of personality conflicts with other prominent figures in Soviet aviation circles has been suggested as another factor that might have limited his career advancement and public visibility. Military organizations, like any large institutions, are affected by interpersonal dynamics that can influence professional opportunities regardless of individual competence or achievement. Such conflicts might not appear in official records while still affecting career outcomes. Regional or ethnic considerations may have played subtle roles in determining which wartime heroes received sustained attention from propaganda organizations. The Soviet Union's complex nationality policies created preferences that could affect individual career prospects, though such factors were rarely acknowledged explicitly in official documentation. Vorozheikin's background and service record might not have aligned perfectly with changing political calculations about representation and symbolism. The timing of his peak achievements relative to broader political developments could have influenced long-term recognition patterns. Heroes whose victories occurred during periods when the Soviet leadership needed specific types of propaganda support might have received more sustained attention than those whose contributions came at times when different themes were being emphasized in public communications. Some speculation has focused on possible involvement in classified projects or operations that required limiting public discussion of his activities and achievements. The Soviet military conducted numerous secret programs during and after the war, and participation in such activities might have necessitated maintaining lower public profiles for involved personnel, regardless of their contributions to national defense. The evolution of Soviet aviation historiography during different political periods may have affected how various wartime figures were presented in official accounts. Changes in leadership, policy emphasis, and international relations could influence which aspects of military history were highlighted or de-emphasized in educational materials and public presentations. Such shifts might gradually reduce attention paid to specific individuals without any deliberate decision to diminish their recognition. Personal preferences for privacy over publicity could have contributed to his limited public profile, as officers who preferred to focus on their professional duties rather than cultivating media relationships might naturally receive less attention from historians and biographers. The systematic temperament that characterized his professional approach might have extended to reluctance for personal promotion or celebrity status. The principles that guided Vorozheikin's approach to aerial warfare retain relevance for contemporary military aviation despite dramatic changes in technology, tactics, and strategic context. His emphasis on systematic analysis and methodical preparation offers lessons that transcend the specific aircraft and weapon systems of his era, providing insights applicable to modern combat operations that involve similar fundamental challenges of decision-making under uncertainty. Modern military aviation training programs incorporate elements that reflect his understanding of how successful pilots develop the intellectual frameworks necessary for effective performance in complex, rapidly changing environments. The analytical approach he championed has influenced curricula that emphasize critical thinking alongside traditional flying skills, recognizing that technological advancement requires correspondingly sophisticated human responses. His contributions to tactical innovation during the Great Patriotic War established precedents for adaptation and improvisation that remain relevant for contemporary pilots facing new threats and unfamiliar operational environments. The ability to analyze enemy capabilities systematically while developing effective countermeasures represents a timeless aspect of military effectiveness that modern aviation units continue to emphasize in their training and operational planning. The leadership principles he demonstrated during his progression from individual pilot to senior commander provide models for developing officers who can balance technical expertise with administrative responsibility. Modern military organizations face similar challenges in identifying and preparing personnel who can contribute effectively at multiple levels of responsibility throughout their careers. Research into his tactical methods has contributed to historical understanding of how successful combat pilots developed their skills and adapted to changing circumstances during extended conflicts. These studies inform contemporary discussions about pilot training, leadership development, and organizational learning that seek to apply historical lessons to current challenges faced by military aviation units. Aviation museums and historical organizations have gradually begun to recognize his contributions alongside those of more celebrated contemporaries, providing more comprehensive perspectives on Soviet aviation achievements during the Second World War. These efforts help correct historical narratives that may have underrepresented certain individuals due to political or administrative factors unrelated to their actual contributions. The methodology he employed for analyzing tactical problems has influenced approaches to combat training that emphasize systematic preparation over instinctive responses. Modern simulators and training systems can replicate many aspects of his analytical framework, allowing contemporary pilots to practice the decision-making processes that enabled his success without requiring actual combat experience. His example demonstrates how individual excellence can be achieved through disciplined application of systematic methods rather than relying solely on natural talent or aggressive instincts. This perspective has implications for contemporary military personnel who face similar challenges of mastering complex systems while maintaining effectiveness under stress. The integration of his tactical innovations into broader doctrinal development illustrates how individual contributions can influence institutional learning and organizational effectiveness over extended periods. Modern military organizations continue to face similar challenges of identifying, preserving, and disseminating lessons learned from successful practitioners of their profession. The fragments of memory surrounding Vorozheikin's later years reveal a man who had successfully navigated the transition from wartime hero to peacetime professional, though not without personal costs that remained largely invisible to outside observers. Colleagues from his post-war service remember him as a demanding but fair superior who maintained the same methodical standards that had characterized his combat career, applying systematic analysis to administrative challenges with the same intensity he had once directed toward aerial warfare. Letters and documents that survived the Soviet period provide glimpses of personal relationships that were affected by the complexities of maintaining heroic status within a political system that demanded continuous loyalty demonstrations alongside professional competence. Family members recalled the difficulty of sharing their lives with someone whose public identity was carefully managed by institutional authorities, leaving little space for private expression or personal vulnerability. The generation of pilots he trained carried forward his analytical approach to flying and leadership, though many were unaware of the specific historical context that had shaped their instructors' methods. His influence on Soviet aviation doctrine extended through these personal connections long after his direct involvement in operational planning had ended, creating indirect contributions that may have been more significant than his individual combat achievements. Archival research conducted after the collapse of the Soviet Union has revealed additional details about his career that were previously classified or simply overlooked by historians focused on more politically prominent figures. These discoveries have gradually enhanced understanding of his contributions, while highlighting the arbitrary nature of how historical recognition is distributed among individuals with comparable achievements and service records. The psychological profile that emerges from these materials depicts someone who successfully compartmentalized the intense experiences of combat flying, while maintaining functional relationships with colleagues and subordinates throughout his extended military career. The methodical temperament that had served him well in aerial warfare proved equally valuable for managing the complex personal adjustments required for peacetime service in an organization that had been transformed by victory and technological change. Technical innovations he developed for training programs influenced generations of Soviet pilots who learned their craft through methods he had refined based on his combat experience and analytical observations about how successful aviators developed their skills. These contributions to aviation pedagogy may ultimately prove more lasting than his individual combat achievements, though they are less visible to historians focused on dramatic battlefield events rather than institutional development. His death on May 13, 1974, marked the end of a career that had spanned the most transformative period in aviation history. From the primitive aircraft of the 1930s to the sophisticated jet fighters that dominated Cold War military planning. The obituaries that marked his passing reflected the complex legacy of a man whose individual achievements were significant, but whose public recognition remained limited by factors that extended beyond personal accomplishment. The final assessment of Vorozheikin's place in aviation history must acknowledge both his exceptional combat record and the institutional factors that shaped how that record was preserved and presented to subsequent generations. His systematic approach to aerial warfare demonstrated that individual excellence could be achieved through disciplined application of analytical methods, providing lessons that remain relevant despite dramatic changes in technology and strategic context. The contrast between his documented achievements and limited public recognition illustrates broader patterns in how military history is constructed and preserved, often reflecting political and administrative considerations that have little connection to actual battlefield contributions. Understanding these patterns helps explain why certain heroes achieve lasting fame, while others, equally deserving, remain known primarily to specialists and enthusiasts. Perhaps the most significant aspect of his legacy lies in the example he provided of how exceptional performance can be sustained over extended periods through systematic preparation and methodical analysis, rather than relying on inspiration or instinctive responses alone. This approach to professional development offers insights that extend beyond military aviation to any field that requires sustained high performance under stressful conditions. The documentation that survives from his career suggests someone who understood that individual excellence must be balanced with institutional loyalty and collective effectiveness to achieve lasting impact. His ability to maintain this balance throughout the changing demands of wartime combat and peacetime service demonstrates qualities that deserve recognition regardless of whether they align with conventional narratives about heroism and achievement. In the end, Arseny Vorozheikin represents both the possibilities and limitations of individual achievement within large institutional structures. His story reminds us that history's most celebrated figures may not always be those who contributed most significantly to their institutions or societies, and that understanding the full scope of human achievement requires looking beyond the simplified narratives that dominate popular understanding of complex historical periods. The methodical pilot who rose from rural obscurity to become a twice hero of the Soviet Union ultimately achieved something more valuable than fame. He demonstrated that systematic excellence, sustained over time, can create lasting contributions that benefit others long after individual recognition fades. In an age that often celebrates dramatic gestures over consistent performance, his example offers a different model of how to measure success and evaluate the significance of a life dedicated to professional excellence and service to larger purposes. His legacy lives on not in the monuments or memoirs that commemorate more celebrated contemporaries, but in the analytical frameworks and training methodologies that continue to influence how military aviators develop their skills and approach their responsibilities. This may be a quieter form of immortality than public fame, but it represents a more direct and lasting contribution to human knowledge and institutional effectiveness. The peasant boy who learned to hunt in the sky ultimately taught others how to think systematically about the challenges they would face in their own aerial battles. That intellectual contribution may prove more enduring than any individual combat victory, offering lessons that transcend the specific historical circumstances in which they were first developed and validated through the ultimate test of aerial warfare. The silence that surrounds his name in popular accounts of Soviet aviation achievement speaks not to the insignificance of his contributions, but to the complex factors that determine how history remembers its heroes. In recovering his story, we gain not just knowledge about one remarkable individual, but insight into the broader patterns that shape collective memory and influence how societies choose to honor those who serve them with exceptional dedication and skill. The sky that once echoed with the sound of his aircraft engines has long since fallen quiet, but the principles he demonstrated continue to guide those who follow similar paths of service and excellence. In this way, Arseny Vorozheikin achieved a form of victory that extends far beyond the tactical successes that first brought him recognition, creating a legacy measured not in destroyed enemy aircraft, but in the improved effectiveness of all who learned from his systematic approach to the deadly art of aerial warfare.